Every night, something strange happens to you. You lie down, close your eyes, and within minutes, your awareness of the world begins to disappear. For hours, you stop watching for danger. You stop looking for food. You stop protecting yourself. Your reactions slow. Your muscles relax. Your conscious awareness fades, and you do this voluntarily, night after night. Over the course of an average human life, sleep consumes roughly 1/3 of our time. If someone lives for 90 years, close to 30 of those years may be spent asleep. 30 years. From an evolutionary point of view, that is an extraordinary amount of time to surrender. Imagine our distant ancestors sleeping in a world without locked doors, alarm systems, electric lights, or safe bedrooms. Darkness meant predators. Rival groups could approach unseen. Fire could die. Weather could change. A sleeping person was less aware of all of it, and yet our ancestors slept. Their ancestors slept. And generation after generation, natural selection never eliminated the need. That creates one of the strangest questions in human biology. Why? Evolution is ruthless with expensive traits. If something consistently reduces an organism's chances of surviving and reproducing without providing a greater advantage, it tends not to remain unchanged forever. Sleep is extremely expensive. A person who needs 8 hours of sleep loses 8 hours that could theoretically be used for finding food, caring for children, watching for danger, building shelter, forming relationships, or reproducing. The obvious evolutionary solution seems almost embarrassingly simple: sleep less, or better still, do not sleep at all. Imagine 2 prehistoric humans living in the same environment. One needs 8 hours of sleep. The other receives all the same biological benefits while remaining awake. The second person would gain thousands of additional waking hours every year. More time to search for resources, more time to detect threats, more time to care for offspring, more time simply to survive. If such a human were biologically possible, we might expect evolution to favor that advantage. But that is not what happened. Instead, the human brain developed elaborate systems that make sleep difficult to escape. Stay awake long enough and your ability to concentrate begins to deteriorate. Reaction time slows. Judgment becomes less reliable. Memory suffers. Emotions become harder to regulate. Eventually, the pressure to sleep becomes overwhelming. You can fight hunger. You can postpone drinking for a while. You can force yourself through exhaustion. But indefinitely refusing sleep is not something the human brain seems willing to tolerate. That suggests something important. Sieve is not simply a period when the brain has nothing better to do. Something is happening during those apparently lost hours that is valuable enough to justify the cost. And for most of human history, nobody knew what it was. To our ancestors, sleep must have been one of the most familiar mysteries of existence. Every evening, consciousness disappeared. Dreams arrived from nowhere. Hours passed without awareness. Then the mind returned. Ancient cultures created explanations for this strange daily disappearance, but the biological reason remained hidden. Even today, after decades of neuroscience, the complete answer is still not settled. We know that sleep affects memory. We know it affects learning. We know it interacts with metabolism, immune function, hormones, emotional regulation, and the way the brain maintains itself. But knowing what sleep does is not quite the same as knowing why evolution made sleep unavoidable. Because there is another possibility. Perhaps we have been asking the question backwards. Perhaps sleep survived not despite evolution. Perhaps sleep survived because somewhere deep in our biological history, being unconscious for part of every day became more useful than remaining awake. To understand how that could possibly be true, we have to look inside the sleeping human brain. Because when your eyes close and your awareness disappears, your brain does not simply switch off. In some ways, its most interesting work is only beginning. The sleeping human brain is anything but inactive. For a long time, sleep was easy to imagine as a kind of shutdown. The body became still, the eyes closed, and consciousness disappeared. It seemed reasonable to assume that the brain simply reduced its activity until morning. But when scientists began measuring the electrical activity of the brain, that picture changed. Sleep turned out to be an organized biological state, made of repeating patterns that the brain moves through again and again during the night. As you first begin to fall asleep, the transition can feel almost invisible. One moment you are thinking about something that happened during the day, then your thoughts become less orderly. Sounds around you seem more distant. You may suddenly realize that you were thinking about something that made no sense at all, and then you are asleep. Your brain has entered the first stages of non-REM sleep. At first, this sleep is relatively light. You can still wake easily. But as the night continues, the brain can descend into much deeper sleep. During deep sleep, large populations of neurons begin showing slow, coordinated patterns of electrical activity. Your heart rate and breathing generally slow. Your body becomes less responsive to the outside world. Waking you becomes more difficult. This is not simply the brain becoming weaker or quieter. It is changing the way it operates. And that difference matters. While you are awake, your brain is constantly receiving information. Faces, voices, movement, language, distances, smells, threats, decisions. Even while you are sitting completely still, enormous amounts of information are being processed. At the same time, the brain is changing. Connections between neurons can strengthen or weaken as you learn and experience the world. New information has to be integrated with what is already there. Important experiences may need to be retained, while countless irrelevant details can eventually be discarded or reduced. SEEPs appears to participate in these processes. Experiments have repeatedly shown that sleep can improve the retention of newly learned information and skills. Depending on the kind of memory involved, different stages of sleep appear to contribute in different ways. That means something remarkable happens after you learn. Suppose you spend an afternoon practicing a new skill. You stop practicing in the evening. You go to bed. For several hours, you consciously do nothing with that skill. Yet the sleeping brain continues processing what happened while you were awake. By morning, performance can sometimes be better than it was before sleep. You improved while you were not practicing. This does not mean that sleep magically creates knowledge that was never learned. Instead, sleep seems to help stabilize, reorganize, and integrate information already acquired by the brain. And memory is only part of the story. During waking life, the brain is constantly adjusting the strength of connections between neurons. Learning depends on this ability, but a system that only strengthened connections indefinitely would eventually face problems. One influential idea proposes that sleep helps recalibrate some of these connections, preserving important changes while reducing unnecessary activity. Scientists are still investigating exactly how this works, and no single mechanism explains everything sleep does. But the larger picture is becoming difficult to ignore. Being awake places demands on the brain. Sleep changes the conditions under which the brain can respond to those demands. And then, during the night, something even stranger happens. After moving through non-REM sleep, the brain periodically enters a state called REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement. During this stage, the eyes can move beneath the eyelids. Breathing becomes more irregular, and brain activity begins to resemble waking activity in important ways. This is also the stage strongly associated with vivid dreaming, although dreams can occur during other stages as well. But there is a remarkable contradiction. The brain can be highly active while most of the body's major voluntary muscles are temporarily inhibited. you are lying almost motionless. Your connection to the outside world is greatly reduced, yet inside your head, an entire reality can appear. You can run through a city that does not exist, speak to someone you have not seen in 20 years. Stand inside your childhood home, feel fear, happiness, embarrassment, or grief. And while it is happening, much of it can feel completely real. Why the human brain dreams remains an open scientific question. Dreaming may relate to memory, emotion, internal models of the world, or several processes at once. There is no single proven explanation that accounts for every dream. But REM sleep itself is clearly not meaningless biological noise. It is a highly regulated state that repeatedly returns throughout a normal night. And this brings us back to the evolutionary problem. The human brain does not merely tolerate sleep. It carefully constructs it. It moves through different stages. It regulates their timing. It creates increasing pressure to sleep when we remain awake too long. It changes neural activity, body temperature, hormone release, muscle activity, breathing, and responsiveness to the environment. This is an extraordinary amount of biological machinery devoted to something that, from the outside, looks like doing nothing. So perhaps the real cost of sleep is only half of the equation. Yes, our ancestor became more vulnerable when they slept, but what happened when they did not sleep may have been even more dangerous. A human being survives not only through strength. We survive by remembering where resources are, by recognizing faces, by reading the intentions of other people, by learning from mistakes, by making decisions under pressure, by controlling emotion, by reacting quickly when something changes. For our ancestors, a brain that performed these tasks poorly could be deadly. Forgetting where water could be found was dangerous. Failing to recognize a threat was dangerous. Making a bad decision during a hunt was dangerous. Losing emotional control inside a tightly connected social group could also carry serious consequences. A few additional waking hours would not necessarily be an advantage if the brain using those hours became progressively worse at the very things that kept a person alive. And now the evolutionary puzzle begins to look different. The question is no longer simply why humans waste so much time sleeping. The question becomes why the human brain requires this strange alternating existence at all. Why can it not perform the necessary work while we remain awake? Why must consciousness repeatedly fade for the brain to maintain itself? And how long has this arrangement been part of our history? Because sleep did not begin with modern humans. It did not begin with civilization. It did not begin around the first campfires. By the time anything recognizably human appeared on Earth, the foundations of sleep were already unimaginably old. Long before the first human opened their eyes beneath an African sunrise, sleep was already ancient. Our species did not invent it. Our primate ancestors slept. Earlier mammals slept. And when scientists look across the living world today, they find sleep, or states remarkably similar to it, in creatures separated from us by enormous stretches of evolutionary time. That matters because it changes the question. If sleep were simply a consequence of having a large human brain, we might expect it to appear relatively late in our history. But it did not. The roots of sleep seem to reach much deeper, and that means the nightly experience you had yesterday may contain traces of biology far older than humanity itself. Of course, reconstructing the origin of sleep is difficult. Cellmeab does not fossilize. There is no ancient skeleton that can tell us whether an animal closed its eyes for 8 hours each night. Scientists have to approach the problem indirectly by comparing living species and asking what they share. And even that creates a problem. How do you know whether another creature is actually asleep? With another human, the signs are familiar. They lie down, their eyes close, their responses change. Modern instruments can also measure characteristic patterns in brain activity. But many animals do not sleep the way we do. Some do not have eyelids. Some have nervous systems dramatically simpler than ours. Some do not even have a centralized brain. So scientists cannot define sleep merely as lying down with claw eyes. Instead, they look for a collection of behaviors. An animal becomes unusually still. Its responsiveness to the environment decreases. The state is reversible, meaning the animal can wake rather than being unconscious because of injury or illness. And perhaps most importantly, if the animal is repeatedly prevented from entering that state, it often compensates later. In other words, it appears to become sleep-deprived. Using criteria like these, researchers have identified sleep-like states far beyond mammals and birds. Fish sleep. Insects show sleep-like behavior. Tiny worms do too. And then scientists found something that pushed the possible history of sleep even deeper: jellyfish. A jellyfish does not have a brain like yours. It does not have a cerebral cortex. It does not have anything resembling the complicated architecture that produces human thought, language, autobiographical memory, or the conscious experience you are having right now. Its nervous system is far simpler. Yet experiments with certain jellyfish have found periods of reduced activity and reduced responsiveness that satisfy behavioral criteria used to identify sleep-like states. When those periods are disrupted, the animals can later show increased inactivity, consistent with a rebound response. This does not prove that a jellyfish experiences sleep the way a human does. We cannot say what, if anything, that state feels like from the inside, and it does not tell us exactly when sleep first evolved. The earliest origin of sleep remains uncertain, but it gives us an extraordinary clue. Some of the basic biological machinery behind sleep may have existed before the evolution of the complex brains we normally associate with it. And if that is true, then sleep may not originally have evolved to serve the sophisticated functions we notice most easily in ourselves. Human memory came later. Human language came much later. Human dreams, at least in the rich form we can describe to one another, depend on a brain that did not exist when the deepest foundations of sleep may already have been developing. So what was sleep doing before there was a human mind to consolidate a childhood memory or rehearse a difficult piano movement? The answer may lie in something much more fundamental. Life on Earth has always existed in cycles: day and night, light and darkness, warmth and cold, periods of opportunity and periods of danger. Earth rotates once roughly every 24 hours, and living organisms evolved on a planet where environmental conditions changed predictably with that rotation. For early organisms, being equally active at every moment was not necessarily useful. There were times when food was easier to find, times when predators were more dangerous, times when temperature made activity costly, times when remaining inactive could conserve energy. Long before humans invented clocks, biology had already begun keeping time. Today, your own body contains an internal timing system that helps coordinate when you feel awake and when you feel sleepy. Light reaching the eyes provides one of its most important signals. In the morning, light helps synchronize the brain with the external day. As evening approaches and light conditions change, the biological processes preparing the body for night also change. One hormone involved in this timing is melatonin. Its levels normally rise in the evening under dim light conditions, helping signal biological night. But melatonin is not a chemical switch that simply knocks you unconscious. Human sleep emerges from the interaction of several systems. One tracks biological time. Another tracks how long you have been awake. The longer you remain awake, the stronger the pressure to sleep generally becomes. This is why staying awake all night feels fundamentally different from simply shifting an appointment on a calendar. Your conscious plans may say that you want to remain awake. Your biology keeps its own account, and we can feel the conflict. Your eyelids become heavy. Attention wanders. You reread the same sentence. You forget what someone said seconds earlier. You make mistakes that would normally seem obvious. Eventually, tiny intrusions of sleep can appear even when you are trying to stay awake. For a modern person sitting safely at home, that may be frustrating. For a person driving a car, it can be lethal. And for an ancestor depending on judgment, coordination, memory, and constant cooperation with other people, severe sleep loss could also have carried serious costs. This is where the ancient history of sleep reconnects directly with us. Evolution did not simply hand humans an old behavior and leave it untouched. As our ancestors changed, sleep became integrated into an increasingly complex brain. And eventually, something unusual happened. Our ancestors became a species that could manipulate the night. They controlled fire. They created shelter. They slept near other people. Much later, they built villages, towns, and cities. Then came candles, lamps, gaslight, electricity, televisions, computers, and phones. For the first time in evolutionary history, humans gained the ability to push darkness away almost whenever they wanted. But the ancient timing systems inside us did not disappear. A person lying in bed today may be surrounded by technologies that would have been unimaginable even a few centuries ago. The room can remain bright at midnight. A glowing screen can deliver conversation, entertainment, work, fear, excitement, and information without end. We can cross several time zones in a single flight and expect our bodies to immediately accept that noon has somehow become midnight. We can work while the rest of the city sleeps. We can drink caffeine when the brain begins demanding rest. In other words, human culture has become extraordinarily good at negotiating with sleep. Our biology is much less willing to negotiate, and this creates a remarkable situation. The oldest part of the mystery is evolutionary. But one of the largest experiments in the history of sleep is happening right now inside us. Millions of people routinely ask an ancient biological system to adapt to a world of artificial light, night work, alarm clocks, international travel, and screens. To understand what happens when we do that, we need to understand something that is easy to overlook. Sleep is not simply about how many hours you spend unconscious. The human body also cares deeply about when those hours occur. The timing of human sleep is controlled by two powerful forces working together. The first is the pressure that builds while you are awake. From the moment you wake in the morning, that pressure gradually increases. One of the substances involved is adenosine, a chemical that accumulates in the brain during prolonged wakefulness and contributes to the growing drive to sleep. This is also where one of the most widely used drugs in human history enters the story: caffeine. When you drink coffee, caffeine does not erase the biological need for sleep. It mainly interferes with adenosine signaling by blocking its receptors. For a while, the feeling of sleep pressure can be reduced, but the underlying need for sleep has not simply vanished. This is one reason caffeine can make a tired person feel more alert without restoring everything that adequate sleep would have provided. The second force is your circadian system, deep inside the brain. A small region called the suprachiasmatic nucleus helps coordinate the body's approximately 24-hour rhythms. It receives information about light from the eyes and helps synchronize many processes throughout the body with the external day. Sleepiness and alertness are therefore not controlled only by how long you have been awake. Timing matters. You can experience this yourself. Sometimes you become extremely sleepy in the evening, remain awake anyway, and then unexpectedly feel more alert later. Or you may wake far earlier than usual after too little sleep and feel terrible, only to become temporarily more functional as the morning continues. The amount of sleep pressure has not necessarily disappeared. Your circadian system is changing the strength of the biological signal promoting wakefulness. The result is not a simple on-off switch. It is more like a negotiation between two ancient systems. One asks how long you have been awake. The other asks what time your body believes it is. Most of the time, they cooperate. At night, accumulated sleep pressure is high while the circadian system is moving the body toward its biological night. In the morning, sleep pressure has fallen, and the circadian system increasingly supports wakefulness. But modern life can force those systems apart. Consider a person working an overnight shift. At 3 in the morning, they may desperately need to remain focused. Perhaps they are a doctor, a nurse, a security worker, a factory employee, a truck driver, or a parent trying to calm a newborn child. Their reason for staying awake may be completely rational. Their brain does not care. It is still operating according to biological systems shaped long before night shifts existed. Now consider what happens after a flight across several time zones. You arrive in another country. The clock says it is morning. Sunlight enters the room. Everyone around you is beginning the day. But inside your body, many biological processes are still synchronized closer to the time zone you left behind. You know where you are. Your cells have not fully caught up. That mismatch is jet lag, and it reveals something profound about sleep. Our sense of time is not purely psychological. Time is built into our biology. Hormones, body temperature, digestion, alertness, and sleep are coordinated by rhythms that cannot always be moved instantly, simply because we want them to move. For most of human evolution, there was little reason for them to. No prehistoric human crossed an ocean in 10 hours. No hunter-gatherer turned on thousands of artificial lights and transformed midnight into an imitation of noon. No one spent the final hour before sleep holding a bright, interactive screen centimeters from their face. Modern humans have changed the environment around sleep much faster than evolution could redesign the systems controlling it. But this does not mean that our ancestors always followed the simple pattern we now consider ideal. The popular image of ancient humans falling asleep at sunset and remaining unconscious for 8 uninterrupted hours until sunrise is too simple. Human sleep is flexible. Historical records from some pre-industrial societies describe periods of nighttime wakefulness between bouts of sleep. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer and other non-industrial populations also show that sleep timing depends on environmental conditions, temperature, social activity, season, and lifestyle. There was never one universal prehistoric bedtime. What remained consistent was something deeper. Humans had to fit sleep into the demands of survival, and sleep created a serious problem. Imagine a small group of our ancestors at night. They have children, food, tools, perhaps a fire. Beyond the edge of their resting place is darkness. A person who is awake can hear an approaching animal. A sleeping person may not. A person who is awake can notice another human approaching. A sleeping person has surrendered much of that awareness. If every member of the group became deeply asleep at exactly the same moment, the entire group could become vulnerable. But humans are social animals, and this may have changed the equation. Sleeping near other people distributes risk. One individual does not need to detect every possible danger alone. Differences in sleep timing, awakenings, age, and individual sleep patterns can mean that periods of vulnerability are not always perfectly synchronized across a group. Researchers studying human groups living without many features of industrial life have found evidence that, across a group, someone may be awake during much of the night. That does not mean our ancestors deliberately organized formal guards every night, and we should be careful not to turn limited evidence into a universal story about prehistoric behavior. But it demonstrates an important principle. Human sleep does not exist separately from human society. We evolved as people sleeping around other people, and that may have made an inherently vulnerable state safer. Fire and shelter could reduce some environmental risks. Group living could reduce others. Eventually, human culture began changing the conditions under which sleep occurred, and once the danger of sleep could be reduced, its biological benefits became easier to afford. This may help explain another unusual feature of human sleep. Compared with many other primates, humans tend to sleep for a relatively short total duration, while spending a substantial proportion of sleep in REM. One hypothesis connects this pattern with changes in where our ancestors slept. Our distant primate relatives often sleep in trees. At some point in human evolution, our ancestors increasingly slept on the ground. Ground sleeping sounds more dangerous, and in some ways it probably was. But with fire, social groups, and increasingly secure sleeping places, the ground may also have offered something a tree could not: a more stable sleeping surface. There was less danger of falling from a branch during deep muscular relaxation. Sleep could potentially become more consolidated and efficient. This idea remains an evolutionary hypothesis rather than something we can directly observe in extinct human ancestors, but it points toward a larger transformation. Human evolution did not necessarily solve the vulnerability of sleep by eliminating sleep. Instead, our ancestors changed the environment in which sleep happened. They created safer places. They stayed together. They controlled fire. And eventually they built an entire civilization around protected unconsciousness. Look at a modern bedroom from that perspective. A mattress is not just furniture. A locked door is not just architecture. Curtains, walls, heating, air conditioning, smoke alarms, security systems, and a roof are part of an enormous cultural structure that allows a human being to become unconscious with remarkably little fear. We have become so good at protecting sleep that most of us rarely think about how extraordinary the act itself is. You can close your eyes tonight with the expectation that nothing will eat you. For most people, the greater threat is that an alarm will wake them too early, and yet removing the ancient dangers of sleep created a new opportunity. If sleeping became safer, the human brain could exploit it more fully. That matters because our ancestors were becoming increasingly dependent on something extraordinarily expensive: a large brain. The human brain represents only a small fraction of total body mass, yet it consumes a disproportionately large share of the body's resting energy. It allows us to speak, plan, imagine, cooperate, deceive, invent, remember, teach, and build knowledge across generations. But such a brain also creates enormous demands. Every waking day fills it with information. Every conversation changes something. Every new face must be interpreted. Every mistake can become a lesson. Every important experience competes to become a memory. And somehow, from this continuous flood of information, the brain must decide what to keep. That is where sleep stops looking like a simple period of rest. Because while you are sleeping tonight, your brain will begin working with the life you lived today. By the time you go to bed tonight, your brain will have absorbed far more information than you could ever consciously remember. You may remember an important conversation. You may remember where you parked your car. You may remember something that made you laugh. But you probably will not remember the hundreds of faces you briefly passed, every object in every room, every sound in the background, every movement at the edge of your vision, or every insignificant decision you made. Your brain encountered all of it. The problem is that memory cannot simply be a perfect recording of experience. It has to be selective. Some information matters, most does not. And one of the periods when the brain continues processing recent experience is sleep. This is why researchers studying memory became so interested in what happens after learning. Imagine learning a sequence of movements, Perhaps you are practicing a new piece on a piano. At first, every movement requires attention. Your fingers hesitate. You make mistakes. You repeat the sequence again. Eventually, you stop practicing. Nothing more is added. Then you sleep. When you return to the task later, performance can sometimes improve even though you did not consciously practice during the intervening hours. Something happened between the two sessions. Similar effects have been studied across different forms of learning and memory. Sleep can help stabilize newly acquired information, making some memories less vulnerable to interference. It can also contribute to the reorganization and integration of information with existing knowledge. But the brain does not treat every memory in exactly the same way, and scientists do not describe sleep as a simple machine that takes everything from the day and permanently stores it. Different kinds of memory involve different neural systems. Different stages of sleep appear to contribute differently, and many details remain under investigation. What is clear is that sleep and memory are deeply connected. This becomes especially obvious when sleep is restricted. After insufficient sleep, learning new information can become more difficult. Attention becomes less stable. Working memory can suffer. And if you cannot reliably pay attention when information first arrives, there may be less useful information available to remember later. This creates a problem that almost everyone has experienced. You stay awake longer because you want more time. Perhaps you are studying. Perhaps you are working. Perhaps you simply do not want the day to end. You gain another hour of wakefulness. But the quality of that hour may not equal the quality of an hour when you are well rested. The calculation is not simply 8 waking hours versus 9. The condition of the brain during those hours matters. For humans, this would have been important long before classrooms and office jobs existed. Our ancestors survived by learning. Where could water be found during a dry season? Which plants were useful? Which were dangerous? Where had predators been seen? How did you make a particular tool? Which member of another group could be trusted? How did you navigate across a landscape without a map? Human survival depended increasingly on information passed from one mind to another. A child did not need to rediscover everything from the beginning. Someone could show them. Someone could warn them. Someone could demonstrate a technique that had been refined across generations. Culture allowed knowledge to accumulate, and a brain capable of learning from that culture became enormously valuable. But learning is not useful if information disappears as quickly as it arrives. The ability to preserve and reorganize memory became part of what made the human brain so powerful. Sleep appears to support that ability, and memory is not the only mental function affected when sleep is lost. Attention can become unstable, reaction times can slow, decision-making can deteriorate. People can become more prone to errors. Emotional responses can change. One of the most dangerous features of sleep deprivation is that the person experiencing it may not always have a perfect understanding of how impaired they have become. Subjective feelings and objective performance do not always decline in parallel. You can feel as though you are adapting. Performance may tell a different story. This matters because the modern world gives us many ways to test the limits of wakefulness. We can illuminate the night. We can work around the clock. We can entertain ourselves indefinitely. And we can use stimulants to reduce the feeling of sleepiness. But there is a difference between feeling awake and having a fully restored brain. Caffeine is an excellent example. By interfering with adenosine signaling, caffeine can increase alertness and reduce the sensation of sleep pressure. That can be genuinely useful. But caffeine does not reproduce everything that happens during sleep. It cannot simply substitute for the biological processes occurring across a normal night. This is why the idea of eliminating sleep is much harder than it first appears. To truly remove sleep without consequences, evolution would not merely need to make us less tired. It would have to redesign every important process that currently depends on, benefits from, or is coordinated with sleep: mere neural plasticity, metabolic regulation, immune function, hormonal rhythms, emotional processing, cellular maintenance, and probably processes we do not yet completely understand. The more scientists study sleep, the less it resembles one single behavior with one single purpose. It looks more like a period that evolution has gradually recruited for many different forms of biological work. This may also explain why asking for the single purpose of sleep can be misleading. We do not ask for the single purpose of being awake. While awake, you can eat, learn, run, speak, reproduce, solve problems, escape danger, and hold someone you love. Wakefulness is a biological state in which many things happen. Sleep may be similar. Its original evolutionary function may not have been identical to everything it does in a modern human brain. Once a recurring period of reduced interaction with the outside world existed, evolution could use that period for additional processes. Over immense stretches of time, sleep could become increasingly integrated into the functioning of the nervous system and the rest of the body. By the time the human brain appeared, removing sleep may no longer have been a matter of deleting one unnecessary habit. Sleep had become woven into the system. And one of the clearest demonstrations of that integration is what happens when we repeatedly take sleep away, not for one dramatic all-nighter, but quietly. An hour tonight, another hour tomorrow. 6 hours instead of 7, 5 instead of 6. A little less sleep because work ran late. A little less because a child woke up. A little less because one more episode became 3. A little less because the phone was still in your hand. This is much closer to how sleep loss occurs for many modern humans, and it reveals something important. The brain does not always respond to chronic sleep restriction with one obvious moment of collapse. The effects can accumulate. In controlled laboratory studies, people restricted to short sleep opportunities across consecutive days have shown progressive declines in measures of attention and performance. Yet people do not necessarily feel progressively worse at the same rate. That mismatch is unsettling because it means a tired brain is sometimes being asked to evaluate the condition of a tired brain. For our ancestors, sleep pressure had powerful environmental allies. Night became dark, activity became more difficult, there was less artificial stimulation available. Modern humans removed many of those boundaries. We can now continue feeding the brain information at 2 in the morning almost as easily as at 2 in the afternoon. And the brain responds. Not because smartphones created some entirely new biological weakness, but because they entered a much older system built around light, attention, reward, and time. This is why the modern sleep problem is not simply that humans suddenly became bad at sleeping. We became exceptionally good at staying awake. For the first time, an ordinary person can sit safely in bed and receive an essentially endless stream of novelty, another message, another video, another headline, another image, another conversation. There is always something else to see. The ancient environment eventually became boring enough to sleep in. The modern environment does not have to. And yet, no matter how much information we place in front of ourselves, eventually the same biological demand returns, sleeps, because the brain is not the only part of you waiting for it. While consciousness disappears, changes are occurring throughout the body. Immune activity changes, hormonal signals change, metabolism changes, cardiovascular physiology changes. Even the way fluids move around and through the brain changes across sleep and wakefulness. And this leads to one of the most popular claims about sleep today. You may have heard that sleep allows the brain to clean itself. There is real science behind that idea. But the real story is more interesting and more complicated than the slogan. The idea that the brain cleans itself during sleep sounds almost too perfect. You spend the day thinking, learning, worrying, making decisions, and processing the world. Then you fall asleep, and the brain begins taking out the biological trash. That image became popular for a reason. The brain, like every active organ, produces metabolic waste. And unlike most tissues in the body, it does not contain conventional lymphatic vessels throughout its tissue in the same way many other organs do. Researchers therefore became interested in how waste products move through and out of the brain. One proposed system became known as the glymphatic system. Experiments, particularly in animals, suggested that cerebrospinal fluid can move through pathways around blood vessels and interact with fluid within brain tissue, helping transport certain molecules. And sleep appears to affect this process. That discovery produced an irresistible headline: "Sleep cleans the brain." But biology rarely fits perfectly into a headline. Scientists are still investigating exactly how fluid transport and waste clearance operate in the human brain, how strongly different processes depend on sleep, and how findings from animal experiments translate to people. So it would be misleading to imagine that your brain fills with toxins during the day and then switches on a nightly washing machine when you close your eyes. The reality is more complicated, but the broader point remains important. Sleep changes the physiological environment of the brain. Blood flow changes, neural activity changes, the movement of cerebrospinal fluid changes. The balance between different chemical signals changes. The brain you wake up with is not simply the brain you went to bed with after spending several hours switched off. Those hours contain active biological processes, and the same is true throughout the rest of the body. Consider the immune system. Sleep and immunity influence each other in both directions. When you become sick, you often become tired. That is not merely an inconvenience. Signals produced during an immune response can alter sleep. At the same time, sleep can influence immune function. Studies have linked insufficient sleep with changes in immune responses and inflammatory signaling. This means that sleep is connected to one of the oldest survival problems humans have ever faced: infection. Long before antibiotics, vaccines, hospitals, or even an understanding that microorganisms cause disease, the human body was fighting pathogens. Every wound could become dangerous. Every respiratory infection carried uncertainty. Every contaminated source of food or water presented risks our ancestors could not see. An immune system capable of responding effectively was essential. Sleep became intertwined with that system. Then there is metabolism. The human body does not process energy identically at every moment of the day. Metabolism is influenced by circadian timing, food intake, activity, hormones, and sleep. When sleep is repeatedly restricted, researchers can detect changes in glucose regulation, appetite-related signaling, and other metabolic processes. Again, this does not mean that one short night immediately destroys your metabolism. Human physiology is resilient, but it demonstrates that sleep cannot be isolated from the rest of the body. The sleeping brain is still connected to a sleeping organism. Hormones continue to rise and fall. Heart rate changes. Blood pressure changes. Body temperature follows its rhythm. Tissues continue repairing and maintaining themselves. The body remains alive, regulated, and extraordinarily busy. And this is where the original evolutionary question becomes much harder. At the beginning, sleep looked like a single terrible bargain, lows consciousness for hours in exchange for some mysterious benefit. But there may never have been one benefit. Over evolutionary time, many processes became associated with this recurring state. Once sleep was established deeply enough in biology, evolution could modify what happened during it rather than eliminate it. This is a crucial distinction. Evolution is not an engineer starting with a blank sheet of paper. It cannot look at the human body and decide to redesign the entire system from scratch. Every generation inherits a modified version of what came before. Natural selection works with existing biology. If an ancient sleep-wake cycle was already embedded in nervous systems, metabolism, cellular regulation, and behavior, later evolution could build upon that architecture. And that is exactly what happened with many features of the human body. Our spine was not designed from nothing for a species that sits at desks and walks upright. It was inherited from an evolutionary history that long preceded humans and then modified. Our eyes contain solutions inherited from earlier vertebrates. Our limbs are variations on anatomical structures that existed long before anything walked through a city. Evolution modifies, it repurposes, it compromises. Sleep may represent one of the most profound examples of this history. The modern human brain inherited an ancient rhythm and then made extraordinary use of it. But there is still a problem. Everything we have discussed explains why losing sleep can be costly. It does not completely explain why sleep requires such profound disconnection from the environment. Why can the brain not perform memory processing while you are awake? Why can metabolic regulation not continue normally while you are talking to someone? Why should any maintenance process require you to become less responsive to danger? If sleep is so risky, evolution should favor individuals capable of performing these functions without becoming unconscious. And in some circumstances, the human brain actually does reduce sleep. When circumstances demand it, we can temporarily remain awake longer than usual. New parents know this, soldiers know this. People surviving emergencies know this. Humans are not machines that shut down at an exact hour regardless of circumstances. Sleep is flexible, but flexibility has limits. Push far enough and performance begins to fail. Pliff further and the brain can begin forcing brief episodes of sleep into wakefulness. These episodes can last only seconds. They are called micro-sleeps. A person may appear awake. Their eyes may even remain open. But for a brief moment, parts of the normal processing required for sustained attention can fail. If you are sitting on a sofa, you may barely notice. At highway speed, several seconds can mean traveling the length of a football field without reliably processing the road. The brain is effectively collecting a debt you refuse to pay voluntarily. That tells us something extraordinary about the strength of the sleep requirement. Conscious intention can lose. You can decide that staying awake is important. The brain can eventually disagree, but humans are unusual in another way. We often deliberately sacrifice sleep even when there is no immediate emergency. We trade it for work, entertainment, travel, social life, study, and sometimes simply for a few quiet hours when nobody else needs anything from us. This behavior has become so normal that sleep can feel negotiable. Something we will catch up on later. Something that begins only after everything important is finished. But from a biological perspective, sleep is not what happens after the important work is finished. Sleaze is part of the work, and perhaps the clearest way to understand that is to imagine what would happen if we could remove it completely. Suppose tomorrow scientists invented a treatment that allowed you to remain awake 24 hours a day. No sleepiness, no micro-sleeps, no exhaustion. You would gain roughly a third more conscious life. A person who would otherwise spend decades asleep could experience those decades awake. It would be one of the most valuable technologies ever created. There is only one condition. The treatment would have to replace everything sleep was doing. It would need to preserve learning and memory, maintain attention, protect emotional regulation. support normal immune function, preserve metabolic and cardiovascular regulation, maintain the processes occurring in the brain during sleep, coordinate biological rhythms, and replace functions we may not even have discovered yet. Simply removing the feeling of tiredness would not be enough. We would have to replace an entire biological state. And once you think of sleep that way, the evolutionary mystery changes again. Perhaps the surprising thing is not that evolution failed to eliminate sleep. Perhaps eliminating sleep would have required rebuilding too much of the organism. But there is an even stranger possibility. What if the vulnerability of sleep was not merely a cost that evolution reluctantly accepted? What if being inactive for part of the day was itself an advantage? To see how that could work, we have to return to a very human problem. Sometimes the safest, smartest, and most efficient thing you can do is nothing at all. Sometimes the safest thing a human being can do is nothing. That sounds strange because we usually associate survival with action. Run from danger, reach for food, build shelter, protect your children, solve problems, stay alert. But activity always has a cost. Every movement uses energy. Every journey exposes you to risk. Every hour spent searching for something is an hour in which something can happen to you. And there are times when being active simply offers very little in return. For most of human evolution, night was one of those times. Humans can function in darkness, but we are fundamentally visual creatures. Our eyes perform far better in daylight than in very low light. We do not have the extraordinary night vision of many nocturnal animals. We do not navigate primarily through smell. We do not hunt by echolocation. When the sun disappeared, much of the information humans depended on became harder to obtain. Moving through unfamiliar terrain became more dangerous. Finding food became more difficult. Injuries became easier to suffer. Predators adapted to darkness could have advantages we did not. So imagine an early human group with no urgent reason to travel after dark. Food has been gathered. The group has stopped moving. Children are nearby. There may be a fire. The surrounding landscape is difficult to see. What is the benefit of everyone remaining fully active for another 6 or 8 hours? There may not be one. Energy spent during those hours could instead be conserved for daylight, when humans could see better and accomplish more. This idea has led researchers to consider sleep not only as a period required for internal biological maintenance, but also as a form of adaptive inactivity. The basic idea is simple. An organism does not need to be active all the time. It needs to be active at the right times. If activity during a particular period is inefficient or dangerous, remaining inactive may itself improve survival, could help enforce that inactivity. And this changes the way we think about its apparent evolutionary cost. We began with the assumption that every hour asleep is an hour stolen from survival, but an additional waking hour is valuable only if there is something useful to do with it. If being awake at 3 in the morning makes you more likely to waste energy, become injured, expose yourself to predators, or wander away from the safety of your group, then wakefulness is not automatically an advantage. Sometimes consciousness itself is expensive. The modern world makes this difficult to appreciate because we have made almost every hour potentially useful. At midnight, you can work, you can shop, you can study, you can speak to someone on the other side of the planet, you can order food, you can drive across a brightly illuminated city. You can sit in a climate-controlled room and continue almost everything you were doing during the day. Our ancestors did not live in a 24-hour economy. Darkness imposed limits, and biology evolved within those limits. But adaptive inactivity cannot be the entire explanation for human sleep. If the only purpose were to keep us safely inactive at night, we could simply lie quietly while remaining conscious. We could rest. We could conserve energy. We could listen for danger. We could open our eyes instantly if something approached. That would appear safer than becoming deeply asleep. So something else must have happened. Once a protected period of inactivity existed, biology may have been able to use it. Processes that were difficult to perform while an animal was actively interacting with the environment could increasingly occur during that protected state. Over evolutionary time, the distinction between waking and sleeping could become deeper, and eventually, the organism might become dependent on both. This idea is important because evolution does not need a trait to have the same function forever. A biological feature can begin in one context and later acquire additional roles. Structures are modified. Behaviors are repurposed. Old systems become foundations for new ones. Sleeps may have followed a similar path. Its deepest origins remain uncertain. And scientists cannot reconstruct a single definitive moment when the first animal began to sleep. But by the time humans appeared, sleep was no longer merely inactivity. It had become a complex physiological state integrated with the brain and body. Then human evolution added another layer. We became intensely social, and social life created a brain with unusual demands. Humans do not survive simply by reacting to the physical environment. We survive inside networks of other minds. From infancy, we learn faces, voices, intentions, relationships, rules, alliances, dangers, and expectations. We remember who helped us. We remember who deceived us. We learn what behavior is acceptable inside a group. We infer what another person might be thinking. We anticipate how they may react. We cooperate with people who are not close relatives. We transmit knowledge across generations. This is an extraordinary cognitive workload. Consider how much information is hidden inside an ordinary conversation. You are not merely processing words. You notice tone, timing, facial expression, cachectic previous conversations. Whether the person appears nervous, whether they are joking, whether what they are saying contradicts something they said yesterday, the human brain performs much of this almost automatically. And our ancestors depended on these abilities. For a highly social species, misunderstanding another human could be as dangerous as misunderstanding the landscape. Being excluded from a group could carry enormous costs. Trusting the wrong person could be fatal. Failing to cooperate could reduce access to food, protection, mates, information, and care. The human brain therefore became not only a machine for navigating terrain, but a machine for navigating people. Sleep became part of the maintenance of that machine. Insufficient sleep does not affect only how sleepy we feel. It can affect attention and emotional regulation. It can alter how strongly we respond to negative experiences. It can make complex social interactions harder to manage. Anyone who has been severely tired around other people knows the feeling. Small problems become more irritating. Patience becomes harder. Concentration slips during conversation. You can react too strongly to something that would normally seem minor. This does not mean that every argument is caused by lack of sleep. Human behavior is far too complicated for that, but it shows why emotional regulation cannot be separated from survival in a social species. For early humans, maintaining relationships was not a luxury. The group was protection. The group was information. The group helped raise children. The group could share food. The group could defend against danger. A brain capable of functioning well inside that group offered a powerful advantage. Now, the strange evolutionary bargain begins to make more sense. Sleep removed hours of activity, but the hours that remained could be more valuable if sleep helped maintain the brain that used them. 8 additional hours mean little if judgment, learning, attention, and emotional control progressively deteriorate. Evolution does not maximize the number of minutes an animal is conscious. It favors traits that, in a particular environment, contribute to successful survival and reproduction. Those are not the same thing, and humans provide a particularly dramatic example. We sleep fewer hours than we are awake, yet almost everything we consider uniquely human depends on what happens during waking life: language, art, technology, relationships, marriage, planning, culture. None of these happens because we are unconscious. Sleep matters because of what it allows the waking human to be. This may be the most useful way to understand why evolution kept it, not as time removed from life, but as part of the biological system that makes waking life possible. There is still one problem. If sleep is so deeply integrated into human biology, why does the amount we need vary so much? A newborn can spend most of the day asleep. An adult usually sleeps far less. Older people often experience changes in the timing and structure of sleep. Even among healthy adults of the same age, sleep duration is not identical. And within one person, sleep can change depending on illness, previous sleep loss, schedule, environment, and many other factors. There is no single number that describes every human at every stage of life. Sleep is essential, but it is also flexible, and that combination, something the brain cannot ultimately do without, yet can constantly adjust, gives us another clue about what evolution actually preserved. Sleep is essential, but it is not rigid. That distinction matters. If evolution had preserved sleep as a fixed mechanical requirement, every healthy person might need exactly the same amount every night. We do not see changes across a human lifetime. A newborn may spend much of each day asleep. During infancy and childhood, the brain is developing at extraordinary speed, absorbing language, movement, faces, social rules, and an enormous amount of information about the world. As we grow older, the amount and structure of sleep change. Teenagers experience another important shift. Their biological timing tends to move later. Many adolescents naturally become sleepy later at night and prefer to wake later in the morning. This is not simply teenagers deciding to be difficult. Changes in circadian timing during puberty contribute to the shift. The problem is that modern schedules often move in the opposite direction. A teenager may be biologically inclined toward a later sleep period, while school requires waking very early. That creates a conflict between social time and biological time. Then adulthood arrives, bringing a different set of pressures: work, children, commuting, stress, artificial light, late meals, early alarms, night shifts, phones beside the bed. The biological requirement for sleep remains, but the opportunity to satisfy it becomes increasingly negotiable. And later in life, sleep changes again. Older adults often experience lighter and more fragmented sleep, changes in sleep timing, and alterations in the amount of time spent in different sleep stages. There is no moment when the human body simply stops needing sleep. Instead, sleep follows us from the beginning of life to the end, changing as we change. Even among adults of the same age, there is variation. One person may function well with an amount of sleep that leaves another person exhausted. Genetics contributes to some of these differences. Lifestyle and health matter. Previous sleep history matters. The quality and continuity of sleep matter. And this is why the familiar question, how many hours of sleep does a human need, has a more complicated answer than most people expect. For healthy adults, major medical organizations generally recommend at least 7 hours of sleep per night on a regular basis, while many adults naturally fall somewhere around 7 to 9 hours. But a population recommendation is not a stopwatch built into every individual brain. There are genuine differences between people. There are even rare genetic variants associated with naturally shorter sleep. A small number of people appear able to sleep substantially less than average without the obvious impairment normally associated with chronic sleep restriction. These people are fascinating precisely because they are unusual. They show us that the biological need for sleep can be modified. Evolution has not made every human identical, but they also reveal something else. For most of us, simply deciding that we are a short sleeper does not make us one. You cannot reliably train yourself to need dramatically less sleep simply by repeatedly depriving yourself of it. You may become accustomed to the feeling. That is not necessarily the same as eliminating the biological consequences. And this brings us to one of the strangest features of human sleep. We are capable of being wrong about our own condition. Imagine sleeping too little for several nights. The first morning feels terrible. After several days, you may begin to feel as though you are adjusting. The exhaustion no longer feels as unfamiliar. You learn how to move through it. You drink coffee, you work, you talk, you drive, and you answer messages. Life continues. But controlled experiments on repeated sleep restriction have shown that some measures of cognitive performance can continue to worsen across days even when subjective sleepiness does not increase in exactly the same way. The brain can normalize the experience before performance has fully recovered. That is a dangerous combination. It means the question, "Do I feel okay?" is not always a perfect measurement of whether the brain is functioning at its best. Humans are particularly vulnerable to this problem because we can override biological signals with goals. A tired animal may simply rest when circumstances allow. A tired human can have a deadline. We can understand that we are sleepy and choose to continue anyway. That ability is one of our greatest strengths. We can postpone hunger to finish a task, minimize discomfort during an emergency, remain awake to protect a child, continue moving when exhausted. Human behavior is not controlled by one biological urge at a time, but every act of overriding biology comes with limits. CESP makes those limits unusually visible. If you stay awake long enough, the brain begins to lose the clean boundary between wakefulness and sleep. Attention can disappear for moments, microsleeps can intrude, perception becomes less reliable. Eventually, maintaining continuous normal wakefulness becomes extraordinarily difficult. This tells us that sleep is not merely a habit created by darkness. If it were, artificial light should have liberated us from it. It did not. It only allowed us to delay it. Electricity changed human history. For most of our existence, sunset transformed the environment. Fire could extend useful light, but only locally. Candles and oil lamps helped later societies push activity further into darkness. But illumination remained limited and costly. Then artificial electric lighting changed the night on an enormous scale. Factories could operate after sunset. Streets could remain active. Homes could stay bright. Eventually, television and computers brought stimulation directly into the evening. Then smartphones removed even the need to leave bed. Today, a human can wake at midnight and immediately expose the brain to bright light, social interaction, news, entertainment, work, shopping, games, and almost unlimited information. Nothing like this existed during the overwhelming majority of human evolution. And our sleep system has not been replaced to accommodate it. Light remains one of the most important signals for circadian timing. The effect depends on factors including intensity, timing, duration, and wavelength. Evening and nighttime light can shift or suppress biological signals associated with night. Screens are part of this environment. Although it would be too simplistic to blame modern sleep problems on blue light alone. What we do with those screens matters too. A boring dim page and an emotionally intense conversation are not the same experience simply because both happen on a phone. Technology can delay sleep by providing light. It can delay sleep by consuming time. And it can delay sleep by keeping the brain engaged. That last factor may be the most recognizably human. We are curious. We want to know what happens next. The same brain that once made our ancestors investigate tracks Remember landscapes, listen to stories, and monitor relationships can now be offered novelty without end. There is no natural stopping point. The next piece of information is always one movement of the finger away, so the modern human has achieved something evolution never prepared for. We can make bedtime optional without making sleep optional. Very different things. Those are very different things. We control when we turn off the light. We do not completely control what happens when the brain has gone too long without sleep. And this is why sleep remains such a strange boundary on human freedom. We have escaped many environmental limits that controlled our ancestors. We can remain warm in winter, cool in summer, eat fruit out of season, cross oceans in hours, work in darkness, communicate across continents instantly. But every day, somewhere inside the brain, an ancient process begins counting the hours since we last slept. Eventually, modern technology meets ancient biology, and ancient biology usually wins. Still, there is an obvious question. If sleep is so important, what happens when humans push far beyond an ordinary short night? Not 6 hours instead of 8. Not one late movie, but days of sustained wakefulness. The answer has fascinated scientists, militaries, doctors, record seekers, and exhausted people for generations. And it shows more clearly than almost anything else why evolution never gave us unlimited waking life.